Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today in our session dedicated to the memorialization of the Tulsa Race Massacre and to the ongoing mass graves investigation as part of the University of Oklahoma's Reflecting on the Past, Facing the Future Centennial Symposium. Please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A function, and I will do my best to present them to our speakers, time permitting. If your question is for one of the two speakers or for one or both, please indicate this if you can. Thank you. As a historian of memory culture, I am particularly honored to be in the presence today, albeit virtually, of our two speakers. We are truly enriched by their presence at the University of Oklahoma's symposium today, and our mission today in our panel is to help increase public knowledge about the Tulsa Race Massacre and its commemoration. Brenda Nails-Alford, our first speaker, is a lifelong Tulsan and is the proud granddaughter of 1921 race massacre survivors and Black Wall Street entrepreneurs. Mrs. Alford serves on the 1921 Race Massacre Commission, the Tulsa Race Commemorative Program Committee, the Greenwood Heritage Citizens Advisory Committee. She has also chaired the Public Committee of the Mass Graves Investigation. And our second speaker today is Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield, who is a research assistant scientist at the University of Florida's C.A. Pound Human Identification Laboratory. And she serves as the forensic anthropologist for the Physical Investigation Committee of the City of Tulsa's 1921 Graves Investigation. Among her many honors, Dr. Stubblefield is a recipient of the Ellis R. Curley Foundation Award from the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. First, Mrs. Alford will speak, and then Dr. Stubblefield. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. Over to you, Brenda.
Thank you so very much. I am honored to be able to share our family's story with you today. In 2003, my life would change forever when I received notification from a legal entity here in town that myself and others were being included in a lawsuit against the city of Tulsa regarding reparations for survivors and the descendants of survivors regarding the 1921 race riot, as it was called at that time. I remember reading that letter 5 times, wondering to myself, why was I receiving this and what exactly did it mean? Therein would begin my journey to find our family or the rest of our family's story. My grandparents, James and Vassanora Nails Sr., along with my great uncle Henry Nails, were the proud owners of the Nails Brothers Shoe Shop and Record Shop that was located at 121 North Greenwood Avenue and various locations throughout the community. They were also the first owners of what is now Lacey Park, wherein the Nails Dance Pavilion and skating rink was located. They also operated a limousine and taxi service. On that fateful day, my grandparents and their then 2-year-old daughter, family members and friends ran for their lives from our beloved Greenwood neighborhood, only to return to find our homes and our businesses looted and burned to the ground. We can take that picture down now. Shortly after this occurrence, one of our community members in the name of Mrs. Mary Parrish would write some of the first accounts of those tragic hours, and she would include them in her book entitled Events of the Tulsa Disaster. One of those that she would interview would be my great-grandmother, Rosetta Moore, who would share the following accounts. On Tuesday evening, about 9:30 o'clock, I heard the report that they were going to mob a colored boy, but my family and I remained at home. Then we heard firing. I ran for my daughter. Then a man and his family came running by and he said, "The whites have burned my home in over $7,000. His wife had on about one piece of clothing. Then a crowd came and reported that they were burning and killing as they went, meaning the whites were killing and burning. I ran behind a cabinet, but they were crowding us so closely that I ran out to an outhouse where I began to pray. Then the crowd of whites ordered everybody to come out of the house. But they were slow about coming out, so the ruffians shot against the house. I ran further and saw about 15 white men chasing a man who was helpless. They even fired at him, but missed. I went then upon the hill carrying a small bundle of clothes and bedding. I was lost from my daughter and her baby until late in the afternoon Wednesday. I saw about 5 women faint. At the Presbyterian church, I saw about 4 little children who were lost from their mothers. Old and young had to pile onto trucks. And as we were being driven through town, men were seen clapping their hands, rejoicing at our condition. My great-grandmother would pass away in 1925 and be buried at Oak Lawn Cemetery. These were fine, upstanding members of our community who simply wanted a piece of the American dream, but truly received a nightmare. Today, we pay homage to their strength, courage, and tenacity in the midst of one of the worst atrocities, not only in Tulsa, but U.S. history. It teaches us as a whole that when we face adversities in our own lives, to never give up, keep the faith, and keep moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Alford. Our next speaker is Dr. Stubblefield.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your participation today, your presence. Thank you, Brenda, for your presentation today and participation in this panel. It's just very moving. I appreciate your input. I'm here today to talk about what I call the Centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre physical investigation. It hasn't been 100 years technically, but I wanted to represent to you what little we had at the beginning of the race massacre, because there was a little bit of investigation, and then where we really are now. So I do want to warn you that I do show a few images of human remains, but none of these are skeletal remains. None of the skeletal remains are from people from the Tulsa Race Massacre recovery. These are individuals who were dedicated to education. So the Tulsa Race Massacre, I would like to say the investigation did start 100 years ago, because there was a kind of token effort at a documentation of the deaths involved. And by token, I mean there was some cursory level, just base level documentation. We have death certificates for Black and white decedents, people who died on the 31st and the 1st of June, 31st of May and the 1st of June. And at that time, the state of Oklahoma was taking death certificates. It was already in practice. We can't say it was complete, that every death was recorded, but the practice was started such that you can detect by an examination of the death certificates for the month of June that June 1st and 2nd were peak days for male deaths according to the death certificate records. So the amount of other investigation, well, I will summarize it because I do leave it to my colleague, historian Scott Ellsworth, to provide the details. But for a good summary, you can check the grand jury statement at the time of the race massacre, and the grand jury's conclusion was that the Black men who went to defend Dick Rowland were the cause of the race riot. And that was the nature of the legal investigation at that time. So in the 1990s, late 1990s, the Race Riot Commission was charged with clarifying the historical circumstances of the race massacre. And so we called it Race Riot then. And I was invited to participate in that investigation as a consultant. Scott Ellsworth contacted me, and my colleague, Leslie Rankinhill, and I wrote the chapter on how forensic anthropology would contribute to this investigation. Because even by then, after an 80-year time span, we were aware that we would be investigating skeletal material for signs of trauma. How did these individuals die? And for any features of identification, if there were records, like medical records, that might connect them. So at that time, we didn't know what we would be encountering, and the Race Riot Commission decommissioned itself before there were any physical investigations that were conducted. Now, my interest in joining the commission, at the time I was invited, I was a PhD student collecting data for my dissertation research on body size. And why be involved? I can say that even today, there are very few Black forensic anthropologists, but my tie to the investigation wasn't professional. It was because my parents grew up in Tulsa, and my Aunt Anna, shown here with her husband, E.W. Woods, lost her house in the riot. And that was the scope of my knowledge of the riot. I actually had no previous knowledge. My mother informed me of the loss, Aunt Anna's loss, when I told her that, there was a race riot in 1921 in Tulsa, and I've been invited to participate. And her response was, yes, Aunt Anna lost her house. And that was pretty much the scope of the narrative from my parents regarding what happened. So following in the tradition of being a supporter, and because Ellis Walker Woods was quite an encourager and just a very supportive of the recovery of individuals and Greenwood post-riot. His high school became the field hospital for the injured in Greenwood, because certainly the hospital that was there was burned down during the looting and burning. Ellis Walker Woods would be right behind, I'm pretty sure, be behind our efforts to bring clarity to this hidden history, to what became a hidden history. So what will forensic anthropology do? So at the time, 20 years ago, and even today, I stress that what forensic anthropology is the study of human skeletal remains to indicate what might have killed the individual, and to some extent, how did that person live? What features are in their skeleton that might be connected to a medical record such that they can be ID'd. And every now and then we speculate about their lifestyle, not as often because it's frequently speculation, not fact, but we do speak to features that might be identifying. So here I'm showing you over here, I'll move the cursor, but over here is a part of a pelvic girdle. It's part of a hip bone. The hip bone is rich in features that indicate both what sex the person is and what biological sex they are, and how old they are. Like this surface here changes as we age. So does this surface, but it's fairly difficult to interpret. This particular part of a hip bone is from a male, just in case you're wondering, and a pretty robust guy. But just having this element alone, oddly enough, sometimes just parts of it can be enough to indicate the biological sex of someone. And here I have a set of lower leg bones, the two bones in your lower leg, a tibia and a fibula. And you can see here that they're misaligned because this is a well-healed break. So here is where you start looking for medical records because this break, both bones, there was a cast involved in getting it to heal. There was time to heal involved. So you go, oh, they had time to recover. So you can draw conclusions from injuries beyond just, let's look in the medical record for someone who has a broken left tibia, a left leg. So that's what I will be contributing into the analysis back then and now. Only the difference now is we've actually started excavating and we've actually seen remains. So the work I'm doing and in the coming year or coming months actually stems from work that the Honorable Clyde Snow did. He was a famous colleague of mine in forensic anthropology, much more senior. He was a founding member of our field. And he did the document search for the death certificates of all of the dead, documented dead for the race massacre. in hope of determining how many should we be looking for. The number is still speculative. We don't know how many we'll be looking for ultimately, but we do have a starting number of 38 to 39 individuals because of documentation. Not all still present in Oklahoma. Many of these individuals had their remains shipped home, but thanks to his work and the work of historians like Richard Brooks, we have, Richard Warner, and our former state archaeologist, Robert Brooks, we have information on who has a documented death certificate. So we came back together, the Physical Investigation Committee and the surviving members of the Race Riot Commission consultants, we all came back together in July of 2020 and started physically testing some of the sites that we had identified 20 years ago as likely locations for mass graves. So we had 3 locations, and I didn't take the time to put images of all 3 of these here. Oak Lawn Cemetery was suspected of, if not having mass graves, then of having individual graves of the documented persons from the death certificates. New Block Park is a site that we think might have a mass grave. Nearby, the Canes, which is this area under a bridge trestle and on the Arkansas River, near New Block Park, is also of consideration for a mass grave. And then there's this area that we still want to survey, the privately owned Rolling Oak Cemetery. And that area we do hope to get to by survey this summer if the owner can travel, because the owner doesn't live in Oklahoma. So in July of 2020, we tested some of the results we had from using geophysical equipment, ground penetrating radar, especially to survey the area of Oak Lawn that we call the Sextons area. It is called the Sextons area. And you're seeing a very nice aerial view of that part of the cemetery after we dug through it, looking for the features that showed up on our ground penetrating radar. And what we found was that there's no mass grave here, but there was sign of a previous road running all along here. A curbstone about right here. We dug up a curbstone, but there's road bed all intersecting all through here. And this very deep spot here with the water reflecting from it was a midden, was a dump, like a household dump, and not necessarily a formal dump. That's why I say midden, the technical terms. So we did not find sign of a mass grave. We did find artifacts in that midden area, and we found bone that was animal bone that has butchering marks, these classic sharp edges and thick bone from animals butchered for food purposes. But we did not find any signs of burials, individual or mass. So because of that, we set our next focus on the area we call the Original 18 area, which is a part of the Black Potter's Field that has 2 headstones associated with individuals from the race massacre. So Eddie Lockhart and Reuben Everett. And their markers are there, but we know that Reuben Everett's marker doesn't have any disturbance near it that indicates a burial. So that's a little complicating. And Eddie Lockhart was buried. His body was recovered several days after the other individuals of interest were buried. So we go, where in the Original 18 area are there other burials, or are these other single burials we thought we were looking for? We knew from the newspaper that there were several individuals buried as insurrectionists in the Black Potter's Field. And here's the grainy newspaper version, but you could at least you could trace it back to the Tulsa Daily World but I transcribed part of it so it wouldn't be so painful on the eyes. And the critical part is these are people buried on June 2nd, 1921, as in plain boxes in Oak Lawn in the Black Potter's Field, as according to the newspaper. And we thought as individual burials based on receipts that the Wyatt Funeral Home, Stanley McCune and Mowbray received from the city for burying the individuals. Now, we found later that there was a newspaper article from the morning of June 3rd morning of June 2nd, that morning, that indicated that as of that morning, none of these individuals had been buried. And that makes sense because the diggers would have been in the internment camp. So who was going to bury them? So up until that morning in the hot June days, where some of these individuals died May 31st, there had been no burial and there was no embalming. So there was a need to rapidly get these individuals buried. So what we found, and here is the we, this is our entire great crew, everyone from the mayor to our backhoe operators to my colleagues, we're all here, there's Brenda, getting ready to excavate, we're already excavating, the disturbances we saw in the original 18 area based on this time not ground penetrating radar, but the use of a magnetometer, a device that looks for metal signals under the soil. And so we had several, and here's an aerial view, several disturbances we were interested in. Wait, don't I have an arrow? Okay. So this arrow is pointing to where Eddie Lockhart's tombstone is right there. So we were looking for a disturbance we call anomaly 6 because we could get the backhoe close to it. We wanted to start there because we didn't know what the anomalies constituted. All we had was a signal that there was metal. That's what the signals, that's all you get. So what's interesting about this, and I had to point it out here, even though we're gonna go on from here very rapidly, we're digging here, and here's Eddie Lockhart's headstone, Reuben Everett's right there. Here are 4 more flags, which means we have signals of metal. And then there's all this area. And see all this area here, we had no geophysical data from, meaning it was surveyed and no signals came back. No metal, no disturbances, just nothing interesting. So what happened was we dug here and we encountered a coffin that was formal. It was formal according to the indigent contract. So here's the plate from that particular burial. It says at rest. And this is us checking for wood and other associated artifacts to make sure we got everything. That burial resembled what the contractual burials that the city of Tulsa had for indigent burials: a coffin with a certain amount of thumb screws, a liner, and a plate. And so there's the plate. So we think this person, who turned out to be a female, may have been just a standard indigent burial. There's no marker. Remember, there's no above ground marker that would have told us that there was a formal burial there. What we did encounter was a temporary grave marker that had been buried with the casket. I mean, it was in a standing position and buried by about 3 feet of soil. I don't have a policy for that in cemetery management. So when we encountered that for that burial, we said, well, we should keep surveying in a path that we can accommodate with the backhoe, technically, without disturbing very many graves. So we kept going after those next 4 anomalies, and we encountered more of that coffin burials at about the level of the first one. And this one, see, there's a little plate there. There's a little bit of green here as a plate. So this is the next 2 anomalies going west, next 2. But as we continue going west, all of these markers represent caskets, but they're plain. They are represented by outlines of nails. The wood is completely degenerated. There are no plates. And in many cases, well, at least one case, we found skeletal material very in association with the outline, with rectangular outlines of these very plain, well, it's hard to say caskets when I know that it's really an outline of nails and that's all that's left by this time. And they're very close together. The spacing between some of these caskets is about 1 inch head to foot. And there's a little narrow lane between them. That's a good distance to stand between, and then more caskets start. So you can see how there's a flag here and a flag there. This is the lane. It's not even between them. And we know that there's caskets like right in this margin here. So there's the boundary of this feature. We know this wall, the western margin, because there's steps in it. There were steps cut into it 100 years ago, roughly. I mean, we have not dated it, but the circumstances of this trench look like the circumstances, they resemble the circumstances that we know of from the event. They're crowded together. The few bones I've seen, which were bones from the back of the skull, were robust, meaning masculine. They're crowded together, burials in plain boxes, and we don't know how far north this trench extends. I mean, we have core sampling, so we have a pretty good idea of how far it extends to plain soil, but we have to go back and test it. But we know that this distance goes, this width is repeated at least once more and probably twice more in that direction before we run out of grave disturbance. So, and that's with sampling with a core sampler. So you're talking taking samples that big around and figuring out when the soil stops repeating the sequence we see here that indicates it's fill dirt back on top of burials. And so well, I better get to our next steps because I'll talk about this forever. But the preservation we're seeing is compressed burials. And like for our disturbed formal coffin burial, we actually were able to see the curve of the skull was intact. I don't anticipate seeing that with the plain caskets, but we will see. But we're seeing fragmentary bone, teeth are well preserved, and but the bones are fragile as if they've been buried for 100 years. And so our next steps are to go back to Oak Lawn, to the original 18 area, and excavate it fully and exhume the remains for analysis to look for signs of trauma. And in conjunction with that, we are planning the stage of using DNA to achieve identifications, hopefully. But that is a challenge, and that I'll speak to in the last slide. Also, while we're there this summer, we hope to complete the Rolling Oak Cemetery survey, but we do that in conjunction with the landowner. So we don't have dates for that scheduled yet, so that is the plan. And then there's one additional site in Oak Lawn Cemetery that some of you may remember, the Clyde Eddy site. It is a part of the white Potter's Field. There's a Jim Crow line somewhere in there. It's not visible. So there's a Jim Crow line in Oak Lawn Cemetery. And in the white part of the Potter's Field, there was an area where Mr. Clyde Eddy saw staging for burials from a large container. You know, the two large containers with multiple bodies in them, and hole digging in the white part of the Potter's Field. We have not been able to identify that site yet in our current survey, but we hope to reestablish that location as well. But the timing will depend on how well the excavation of the mass grave in the original 18 area is going. And that area is much more utilized, the white Potter's Field. Well, actually, I take that back. They're both full. It's just that the markers are buried in the black Potter's Field. The genealogy challenge, we have to look at how we're going to get information, DNA, from living relatives of our decedents, you know, especially the ones that are named in the paper, in order to have DNA to compare to. And to do that, we're going to need another organized outreach to possible, you know, people who know that they're descendants of our Greenwood heroes that are buried there in Oak Lawn. But we're talking about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the best of worlds. And by best, I mean if these men had children directly who had children, and preferably sons, because that would be easier on the DNA analysis, but that's another story. But most likely we're talking about cousins, you know, their siblings' children. And those are harder, those relationships are third and fourth cousins and harder to trace back to our decedents. But I have hope. So this is our DNA challenge is twofold, both to reach the public and to be able to get DNA out of these remains. We don't know yet if they'll yield DNA. And we also had to talk, you know, have a conversation with the public about just what does it mean to contribute your DNA how do we maintain privacy? And so that is the nutshell version of where we are. So I will yield to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stubblefield. We are now turning to the Q&A and discussion part of the panel today. And a question that's come in is for Ms. Alford. I'm going to ask her two questions at once, if I may. In fact, they seem to belong together. Ms. Alford, can you talk a little bit about how your grandparents became interested in Oklahoma? And can you also talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in the Greenwood community during your childhood?
My grandparents, like others, I'm sure, heard about the great opportunities that were available here in Oklahoma. The opportunity to raise your families, to have your businesses, to be successful as they were not able to do so in other states, other places. So my grandparents arrived in Oklahoma shortly before statehood and basically settled here. And the rest is history. I am another generation that represents the legacy of the Nails family. They were very proud to be here. They love their community. And we're just very proud to the fact that, you know, they maintained in spite of the race massacre. It was not easy, but they did. And we're very proud of that. Growing up in the Greenwood district for me was wonderful. It was very hard for me to really imagine the race massacre occurring in the community after I learned about that aspect of our family history, because I grew up in such a loving, supportive, encouraging neighborhood. My family, the community members were just wonderful people who all took care of each other. That's what I grew up seeing. Your neighbors were more like your family members, if you will. Everybody helped each other. There were still businesses in the Greenwood district on Greenwood when I was a kid. Our church was right down the street from our home, a property that still remains in our family after almost 100 years now. But I could go and around the corner to the drugstore and get a penny candy. I could go get a ice cream cone, and I did after church with my family right up the street. I got my hair done at the beauty college, if you will, Troops Beauty College. So there, like I said, there were still businesses there. It was very active, very thriving in my time even. And I'm sure that, you know, it really just kind of states, you know, what it must have been back in the 20s, if you will. So it was a wonderful time. The community, our families, our communities, they gave us their best in spite of what they had endured so many years before. And I have to say, I am very grateful.
That's a truly beautiful response, Ms. Alford. The questions now are starting to come in, and I would like to turn to one that is directed for Dr. Stubblefield. A question from Melissa Stockdale. Where does the funding for these excavations and analyses come from? Is the funding sufficient to carry out the entire investigation?
That's a very good question. Most of the funding so far, so the funding to restart the investigation, I say restart because it's 20 years ago, has come from the city of Tulsa directly. So the city commissioners set budgetary dollars aside for the survey, the archaeological surveying we did in 2019 and 2020. And there was a little bit of that left. Then another pot of money was still available to restart this, our return to Oak Lawn. And so we're in a new budgetary year, you could say, because we're on this pot of money, but we do operate on pots of money. So that gets us to is it sufficient? It is not sufficient for the stages after our recovery of the original 18. If these individuals do display signs of trauma or are otherwise all male and crowded in there in an appropriate fashion, and thereby circumstantially are our original 18, the cost to get their DNA extracted and analyzed and genealogies constructed to compare to that DNA is a separate budgetary challenge. But I am very hopeful. Keep in mind that part of our funding model, we are receptive to fundraising, but our mission right now is to make sure we can commemorate the Centennial. So we're very grateful to have the support of the city at the stages we're in right now, because it's important to have this memorialization not be impeded by everybody passing the hat around.
Thank you so much. Let's turn to a question again for Ms. Alford, asking about the commission and the committee. I think a lot of people would like to know what it really means for you to serve on the Mass Graves Public Oversight Committee, and by extension, what does it mean for you to serve on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission?
I am very, very honored to sit on these committees, because I feel that I stand in my grandparents and our family members, our community's stead, to be here at this point in time, to witness these historical events and times, if you will. When I started doing my research after finding about the race massacre aspect of our family history, I began to remember conversations that I heard as a little girl. One of them being that I always knew that my grandmother had to hide in a church for some reason, but I never really knew why. And I was so young, I didn't know the questions to ask. And it was a grown folk conversation, if you will. And when we would pass by Oak Lawn Cemetery, the comment would always be made by the older members of the family that, they're still over there. And everyone in the car would agree, yes, they're still over there. And I had to think about that cemetery as a little girl, because I was always wondering, what's over there? But over time, you didn't hear anything about it. There was no talk about it. And so, like I said, in this day and time, I'm glad to know the truth, to know our story and our community story. So I am very humbled and honored to represent in any way that I can after what our community endured. Serving on the Mass Graves Public Oversight Committee, basically, I know that my grandparents, our community members, could have never imagined this time in history when we'd be talking about the race massacre, that we were no less talking about it, and then trying to find the victims of neighbors and family and friends that they never saw again after those terrible days and hours, if you will. So, as I said, I am very, very honored and humbled to stand in their stead to witness this time in history, because I know that they never could have imagined this time.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Christy, who is an OU alumna, and she's asking Dr. Stubblefield or Miss Alford, do you know the average age of death, at time of death of the victims in the massacre?
Well, I'll speak to that. I mean, unless you want to, Brenda.
No. I definitely leave that to you.
Oh, darn. Okay. The average age is unknown. The death certificates almost uniformly record unknown age or about, and most of the time it's just a question mark or a check that for unknown. A few of the individuals, we have their probable military registration cards. So we can extrapolate from that if it's the same person, and usually it's the same person. Conservatively, it's the same person. And I have ages for about one approximate age for 3 individuals, 30s and 40s. So that may be an appropriate age, early 30s to early 40s, but most often we don't have any information. I hope to think we'll get a little more, because I haven't gone through each name of a named person to see if they had a draft card. But remember, the military information wasn't available until, well, on Ancestry. It's become more recently available for World War I. So there's a chance we'll get a little more.
Thank you. And here's a question again for Dr. Stubblefield about the location of the Rolling Oaks Cemetery. The question is that the one that's on 91st Street? I'm surprised because it's so far removed from the location of the massacre.
I think it is that one. It's the one that's almost in Jenks or is in Jenks. And my geography for Tulsa really just centers around Wilson's Barbecue, because I know it's not there anymore, but Latimer's is still across the street. So, that area is like, oh, that's Tulsa to me. And the rest I have to reconstruct. So, but I've been out to Rolling Oaks a few times, and my surviving aunt is or was in a nursing home out that way. So I'd pass the cemetery on the way to Jenks. And it's not that, so it was a Black cemetery back then in the 1920s. It was the Black cemetery. So think of Oak Lawn as it was city owned. So if you had the money, you could buy a plot in it. And while I don't know the exact circumstances of competing to buy a plot, but I do know, according to the paper, it was full. All the plots had been sold by 1920. All the sellable plots had been sold. So I don't know what rules they used on the indigent part, because that area was active for whites and Blacks. It's that southern strip of Oak Lawn. So that's fine. You go, okay, if I don't have enough money for interment, there's the indigent contract. But what if I had plans on where I wanted to be buried? So now, most of my relatives are in Crown Hill, because that was, I guess, the favored location for, I don't know the real idea, but I'm assuming it's the favored location for Black burials in some time span, like my aunts and uncles' time span. But before 1920, it was out there Rolling Oaks, generally. So bodies that were encountered while in the reconstruction phase of Greenwood, remains encountered, so these are probably very skeletonized or charred remains, were taken by Blacks out there. So that's the narrative we have anyway, that those remains would have been, where do you take remains that you find when you're clearing your lot? You don't contact the white part of Tulsa at that time. Instead, you take them yourself, or maybe Jackson Funeral Home did, out to Jenks. I don't know enough about the narratives about the Rolling Oaks location to know what type of burials we're even thinking, mass or single burials.
That's interesting. I have a question here from Dr. Daniel Simon, and it is for both of you. Could you speak about the plans for the public to be involved in future processions, for example, carrying the remains, that sort of thing?
Well, there is a plan.
Okay, go for it. Go for it, Phoebe.
So think of it as two plans, because I'm handling the skeletal analysis phase of this investigation, but we still have a memorialization phase, and that there's a gap even in between there, because we don't have a reinterment site except Oak Lawn, and so if we have plans in development, Kevin Ross, the chair of the the Public Oversight Committee, he would speak better to what those plans, because I know a little bit, but I can't disclose anything. So we would need him to speak to how far the plans have developed at this time in terms of permanent memorialization. But in terms of the process of recognizing that we're disinterring remains for analysis and temporarily storing them or reinterring them in Oak Lawn, yes, I have plans, and with Kevin Ross, to memorialize or ritualize that process, at least to the extent that there be a procession of some part from the gravesite to the analytical floor, the analytical building. And the part I envision is an additional drape for the caskets. Problem being, I'm not an artist, but the scene, well, I have ideas. Kevin has ideas. They're both, actually I like Kevin's idea a little better, but the idea being that aside from typical funeral draping, where the casket cover would go over the remains, let us have a commemorative drape and then an escort by our Public Oversight Committee members on site to the analytical space. And just in a way, hopefully that won't overtax our Public Oversight Committee members, because remember, it'll be summer and we are talking at least 18 to 19 documented individuals. And then I have an additional concern, because this is the indigent area of the cemetery, and Oak Lawn is a well-organized cemetery. It is demonstrated that it is well-organized even while we've dug through it. And in that regard, we might encounter individuals who also were buried after June 2nd. And that's because Reuben Everett died, well, he died on June 1st, but his remains weren't recovered until the 6th. So if he's buried there, there had to be a way to still enter remains into an area where the soil is so hard, so firm. And then at the same time, people are dealing with reconstruction and not being able to move freely in Tulsa. So in that context, I don't know that we won't have more than the 18, 19. The reason why I keep saying 18 is original 18, but the 19th person is an infant, and infants don't preserve well often. And so I don't know that we'll find any sign of the infant. My colleague, Carrie Stackelbeck, is very optimistic, but so we'll see. But yes, long story short, we do have a plan, but my end of it is while we're on site doing the exhumations, but we will have another plan that probably the Public Oversight Committee will spend most of its process on, I hope, on how do we get people from Oak Lawn, get our deceased from Oak Lawn to another site, or if it's not another site, how do we formally reinter them wherever? Because there's probably a third stage in there if you think about it, because I would like to see the end of this, the end of the Oak Lawn part, because it was so well documented historically that these individuals were buried as insurrectionists, which I find very annoying, but I know history. I would like it to be memorialized as like a federal site, some kind of federal historic site, not, I can't speak for Oklahoma, and states get to possess themselves, I get it, but this event went national, and reversing the masking of this history has become national. I would like the memorialization of these heroes to be national, even at Greenwood and at Oak Lawn and at wherever they get reinterred, at both locations, as sites to recognize as having permanent place in the history of the Greenwood disaster, and so the Tulsa race massacre. So but I don't get to plan that, so that's what I mean.
There is definitely ongoing conversation with the Oversight Committee members, and to Phoebe's point, I do believe or hope that we do have some sense of memorialization for Oak Lawn as well, because that's where the history is. And so having it there and maybe another location, whatever is decided, would be, I think, beneficial. Because at the end of the day, just as the name of the race riot was changed to race massacre appropriately, we don't want to forget the history of what the term riot represented for our community members, our families, because we didn't get restitution for losing our homes, our businesses because of that term. So that is very much still a part of our history. But at the same time, the term massacre, is appropriate because that is felt that is exactly what it was. So as far as, Oak Lawn Cemetery and interment at another location, we don't want to forget the history of Oak Lawn either. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we do bring some sense of justice and healing to our community that lost so much.
Two very significant and powerful responses just then by our speakers. Here's a question for Ms. Alford. Did the atrocities against the Greenwood community of Tulsa stop after the race massacre of 1921?
Unfortunately not. There are accounts where the negative treatment of the community did continue. There were basically plans to continue to obtain the community's properties, if you will. I know in our family that situation did occur some years after the atrocities on Greenwood. There are accounts and city records where properties were obtained for $1 and then sold to other entities for thousands of dollars, which our community members and families did not see any of that. And they definitely could have used it after suffering so greatly. So unfortunately, yes, the atrocities did continue with urban renewal. We've lost a lot of our historic designations, if you will, that should have remained, in my opinion, and did not. So unfortunately, that is the case and was the case.
Thank you. And a question now for Dr. Stubblefield about DNA analysis. You mentioned just now the genetic challenge that this faces. Can you describe in greater detail what you mean by these challenges when identifying decedents through DNA analysis?
So we face two challenges for Oak Lawn. The remains weren't buried in Balm, but they're in a cemetery and at a lower lying area. So we don't know if they've been affected by embalming fluid, and embalming fluid makes it harder to extract DNA from remains. So we won't know until we've done some analysis if the remains will yield DNA. So that's the first challenge, yield DNA that's intact enough for analysis, a part of that. But then we need to hear from the descendants of our decedents, and we haven't had a thorough call or a thorough search for them because we didn't have remains until October. So actually, yeah, I see it. And so now we have to pursue contacting. We need to do the genealogy, but that's the harder path of searching the records, because if you're like me, you start looking at one census page and then you've gone off in 25 directions, all interesting, but none leading to a recent relative that you can contact. But the city directories have been very helpful too. My colleague Scott Ellsworth mentions that they're like gold because they are fairly consistent. They're for Tulsa, so it is possible to get an idea that you have the person and watch them exist, move, and disappear over the years. And so I'm hoping between those two sorts of records and having enough people to actually sift through them, we might be able to find at least where there were relatives that disappeared from Tulsa, in a way where we might be able to pick them up on a later census. Maybe it can be very hard, and I know from my own work. So, but without those relatives, we don't have DNA to compare our decedents to. And then there still is the issue of privacy and how will anyone's privacy, whether they're past or living, how will their privacy be maintained in this process? And so we have coming up a meeting, not yet scheduled, the speaker's not scheduled, but we have planned to have a presentation for the Public Oversight Committee to hear directly from a geneticist about the process, the technical process, and what's at stake and what to expect.
Thank you, because on so many levels, DNA is a highly ethical issue. I want to ask a question that's come up about the city of Tulsa and other entities locally. This question is primarily for Ms. Alford. What barriers were put into place both by the city of Tulsa and other groups to thwart the rebuilding of Black Wall Street and of the community as a whole after the race massacre?
Well, there were efforts put in place by various entities, if you will, to thwart the rebuilding of the community. As far as, how the buildings had to be built, making it very impossible for the community to be able to move forward with that. But one of our lawyers in the community, Mr. Franklin, basically took that to court and basically won the challenge or the discussion, if you will, to make sure that those situations were not put into play to thwart that rebuilding effort of the community. So we're very, very just grateful to him and others who worked along with him, who stood up for the community, for our rights to be able to rebuild and to, basically do away with those efforts by members of the city and other entities to keep that from happening.
I also want to ask more generally myself a question about your vision for community involvement. If someone is watching this, either live today or in the future as a recording, and they want to get involved, how can they become involved in perhaps aspects of the forensic investigation? How might they become involved in future processes of commemoration? And where would a passionate but new member of the community start to volunteer? How would they be able to play a role?
Good question. Because we don't have a centralized. So far, we've had contacts. I've been contacted. Carrie Staplebeck's been contacted. We've received individual contacts. But I would say your best chances for anyone is make sure you're vaccinated for COVID-19, because I would like to reinstate my original plan, which was to have volunteer involvement in some stage of escorting the remains in the lab, even not just between, but in the lab. And there's a fine tradition in having local community assist with escort and curation of the remains until they're returned to interment, packaging them in a I always say quiet but respectful way. And we won't have that in this COVID environment. But I've been vaccinated, didn't kill me. I strongly recommend it. If your body can get the tolerates it, do that to protect your interests in being able to participate as we move forward. And maybe we'll have a centralized approach at some point, for accepting volunteers. But right now we're going with colleagues recommending their students.
Ms. Alford, do you have anything to add to that particular issue?
Basically, it falls into line with what Dr. Stubblefield has said. That is pretty much where we are at this point. I've received requests that I've shared with our Public Oversight Committee from various entities, but right now, that is pretty much where we stand as she described.
Mm-hmm. Can you both reflect on what you consider to be the greater impact of this investigation beyond obviously helping the people of Tulsa and their descendants from the massacre? What is perhaps the long-term impact of the Tulsa Race Massacre investigation, whether forensic or commemorative?
The fact that we're actually talking about the race massacre and the victims of the race massacre, that the discussions are bringing more understanding of everyone as a people, if you will, and understanding everyone's differences. I am very, very appreciative of those opportunities that have come about since we've begun these processes. And I know that they will continue as time goes on to bring about that justice and healing that I described earlier as well.
And I'm in agreement. I think I think we'll end up with the history being known in the way that we say, like, oh, I don't know, this may have timed out, but like I grew up with the Watts riots. You know, it predated me, but I knew that there was that event. And I think we'll go forward, not only having the Tulsa Race Massacre be a permanent part of national history, but also people will look at our investigation and see a moment when Tulsa was demonstrating that it was a city for all of its citizens. You know, this isn't white versus black. This is us conducting this investigation together, even though it's an investigation of a topic that was some of the worst behavior ever from one group to another based on a racial line. But we got it together this time. We have it together.
I'd like to ask you to consider, in a way, what I'm going to call a concluding question. What would each of you consider to be the best case scenario for the investigation into the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921?
As a descendant, you know, the fact that, as I've said before, that we're having the discussions that we're having to promote the healing in our communities, that is very much needed. You know, we're in process of doing that right now, and I am just very, very grateful for that. The work that is being done by Miss Phoebe and others to bring the truth to light, I think, you know, goes so, you know, far, as you will, to just bring understanding. I mean, myself, as I've been working on the Public Oversight Committee, I have learned so much from our wonderful team that about what the dirt tells us, the history that it has, you know, within itself. And as we're sharing that with the community, if you will, I think that goes a long ways to bring trust to the just the processes that are going on at this point in time. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And as Ms. Phoebe said, to bring that education and knowledge to our communities, to our nation as a whole, it goes a long way to bringing that justice and healing that we want to bring.
And I'm in agreement. I mean, part of me would like part of that healing to be at least reparations on the part of any insurers that still exist that insured individuals that lost property. I would love to have that reconciled at a level that has happened for white customers, you know, but you know, I'm not an actuary, and I don't know enough of the history. I don't even know who the insurers were, if they still exist. I just find that, you know, if you can receive a stolen painting and have the insurance company still own it, even after the actual original owners are passed on, I keep thinking that maybe there's actual return that should be occurring. But then you have to find the descendants too. And so that would be a very, very best case, maybe. I say maybe because money doesn't solve things. And we really need to have unity for Tulsa immediately, and as an example of what unity is for other places that have been similarly struck, like here in Florida and Gainesville area, we have a Rosewood that's a similar incident on well, it's a similar incident, and other places similarly victimized. Having the history clarified and made permanently clear goes a long way to establishing unity. So my best case is we have everything apparent, no more hiding, nothing hidden, and that would be very good.
I am so grateful, and I know all the people in the audience are grateful for both of you showing us that this is a hidden history no more, and that further pathways toward justice, unity, truth, and historical unity can be revealed through the efforts of all your team collaborators and the citizens of Tulsa and beyond. So thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation today. And on with the symposium.